Hello, my name is Joseph Busby, and today I'm going to be recording / showing you a video that discusses many of the things that happened during the Roaring Twenties. This was originally meant to be a video that was co-hosted by my friends Ethan and Cameron. They were originally going to list off their parts of the script and read it out, and I was going to list off mine and read mine out. But unfortunately, they couldn't show up to our studio today because of personal matters. But I'm still able to record the audio, and I'm just gonna act as narrator today. Don't discredit them though. They did a lot of work on this. They deserve just as much credit as me, if not more. So, let's get into it. The Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s was a bribery scandal lasting from roughly 1921 to 1923. And was considered the greatest and most sensational scandal in the history of American politics. The scandal involved a Secretary Interior named Albert Fall. He was also a presidential cabinet member who worked for the President Warren G. Harding. Fall was the first to ever be convicted for the crimes that he committed while he was in office, or in other words, he went to prison. Albert Fall accepted valuable gifts, bribes for exclusive rights to drill for oil on federal land, and allowed the oil companies to control government oil reserves. The national security, big oil companies, bribery, and corruption at the highest levels of the government got involved in the scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal shocked the Americans and displayed unparalleled levels of corruption and greed within their federal government. The 1924 United States presidential election was the 35th presidential election held on Tuesday, November 4th, 1924. In the election of 1924, Republican Calvin Coolidge won the election and got awarded a full term of presidency. Coolidge won a decisive victory, taking the majorities in the popular vote and winning almost every state outside of the South. Coolidge was given credit for an excellent economy at home, and no visible crisis had happened. He faced little opposition at the 1924 Republican National Convention. Calvin Coolidge was an American lawyer and politician who served as the 30th President of the United States. He had formerly been the Vice President under Warren G. Harding. During his time as our President, Coolidge did many things. He signed the Immigration Act of 1924, which greatly restricted immigration into the United States. He also refused to separate economics from morality, and he wanted to limit the federal government because it would promote economic growth. He believed that business would provide the energy and resources to help fuel the growth, and that it would also protect economic liberty and the Constitution. There were many great and important inventions that were created throughout the 1920s that impacted American lifestyle and changed life forever. To name a few, one of the inventions that changed American landscape in particular was the automobile. The automobile paved a new way of transportation and travel. It was most effective on constructed paved roads, and was suitable in driving in all different weather conditions. It gave the families the opportunity to vacation in new and distant places. It allowed both young people and women to become more independent from the increased mobility they now had. It also allowed workers to live farther away from their jobs, because they could easily get there. Automobiles made life very easy and convenient, allowing people to get wherever they wanted in a short amount of time. Another important invention that was created by the airplane industry. The airplane industry first started off as a mail-carrying service for the U.S. Post Office. Although the first flights were a disaster, a number of successful flights soon established the airplane as a great way of transportation. Airplanes soon began carrying radios and navigational instruments from weathercasting. Henry Ford created a trimotor airplane in 1926, and transatlantic flights by Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, helped promote commercial airlines and cargo. One last invention that was created during the 1920s was electricity. Electricity transformed most of the nation, and was used by American factories to help run their machines. The development of an alternate electrical current made it possible to distribute the electricity over long distances and transmit it to places like the suburbs and central cities. The city of electrified houses slowly began to increase, and farms were still finding ways to gain some power too. By the end of the 1920s, homes were getting electric irons, refrigerators, cooking ranges, and toasters. These American inventions carried life in the 1920s and helped make transportation and electricity what it is today. Act 2. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment was launched along with the Prohibition era, which made all alcohol illegal. Some believed that too much drinking led to many social problems. This amendment was pushed by two organizations, the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. As arrests for drunkenness began to go down, resentment against government meddling went up, especially among most immigrant groups. Even though the act was passed, sufficient funding was never acquired, leaving the amendment's enforcements almost useless. For those who still wanted alcohol, there were hidden nightclubs and saloons called speakeasies, because you had to speak quietly or easy in order to not get caught. Usually, you need a password or some kind of special card even to get in. As these ways of completely avoiding prohibition got more popular, so did bootleggers. Bootleggers got their name from the smuggler's trick of carrying liquor in bootlegs, and they smuggled it in from other countries such as Cuba and the West Indies in order to sell to whomever would buy. This exploitation and general disliking of the law led to accounts of organized crime in basically all of the big cities, such as Chicago, which is now known as being the territory of the infamous gangster Al Capone, a gangster whose alcohol peddling empire made roughly $60 million a year, and to maintain it, he killed those who dared to oppose it. In the 1920s, there were reportedly 522 vicious gang murders, and Al Capone has now been known to the world for over a century. With the many new modernist ideals that began to rise, it was inevitable that these ideals would begin to clash with those that were more traditional. One of these traditional ideals was fundamentalism, in which they believed in a literal and non-symbolic interpretation of the Bible, and they also believed that everything within it was true. This meant that they greatly disagreed with evolution and Darwinism, especially the idea that humans evolved from apes. Instead, they believed what was in the Bible. To express itself, preachers led revivals based on the authority of the scriptures. One of the most well-known revivalists was Billie Holiday, an ex-baseball player who became a preacher and held many meetings in the South. And in LA, Amy Semple McPherson used some showmanship on her radio broadcasts in order to spread her message. And as fundamentalism gained popularity, they called for laws to stop the teaching of evolution. All this endorsement led to Tennessee passing the first law to make the teaching of evolution a crime in March 1925. But then, the ACLU said they defend any teachers who would go against it, such as John T. Scopes, who was arrested after saying that, like other animals, man evolved. The ACLU hired Clarence Darrow, who was essentially the Phoenix Wright of his time, to defend John, and an ex-presidential candidate and devout fundamentalist, William Jennings Bryan, as prosecutor. John admitted to his quote-unquote crime, and it quickly devolved into a debate about science and religion in schools. See what I did there? You see now, this debate became a national sensation. Hell, even halfway through the case, the court was moved outside, in which thousands of people were watching this unfold. During this case, Darrow asked Bryan many questions about his faith, in which he finally asked, "Do you think the earth was made in 6 days?" And Bryan responded with, "Not 6 days of 24 hours. And despite this answer seeming rather mundane, it essentially shattered the idea of fundamentalism, that the Bible was uninterpretable in any other way besides their own. Despite this, the law was still in place and John ended up getting a $100 fine that a technicality then allowed him not to pay. Okay, if this doesn't sound insane to you, let me put it into perspective. Imagine your history teacher was brought to court and prosecuted by Kanye West for referencing Tiananmen Square during a lesson. And then Kanye West accidentally admitted that Tiananmen Square may have happened. And in the end, Mr. Selby, your history teacher, leaves with a $1,324.39 fine that he wouldn't even end up having to pay. That's just absurd. Anyway, Act 3. During the 20s, a new ideal emerged for some women. The flapper, an emancipated young woman who embraced the new fashions and urban attitudes of the day. Close-fitting felt hats, bright waistless dresses an inch above the knees, skin-toned silk stockings, sleek pumps, and strings of beads replaced the dark and prim ankle-length dresses, whalebone corsets, and petticoats of Victorian days. Many young women became more assertive. In their bid for equal status with men, some began smoking cigarettes, drinking in public, and talking openly about sex actions that would have ruined their reputations not many years before. They danced the foxtrot, camel walk, tango, charleston, and shimmy with abandon. Jesus, these names are hilarious. In 1914, approximately 1 million American students attended high school. By 1926, that number had risen to nearly 4 million. An increase sparked by prosperous times and higher educational standards for industry jobs. High schools of the 1920s began offering a broad range of courses, such as vocational training for those interested in industrial jobs. The excitement of the 1920s also caused some challenges for teachers because they started teaching the children of new immigrant families. Unlike the earlier English and Irish immigrants, many of the new immigrants spoke no English. By the 1920s, their children filled city classrooms. Determined teachers met the challenge and created a large pool of literate Americans. Prior to the 1920s, radio broadcasts were used primarily for transmitting important messages and speeches regarding World War I. After the first commercial radio station, KDKA Pittsburgh, made its debut on the airwaves in 1920, the radio industry changed forever. Listeners tuned in for news, entertainment, and advertisements. Although the media glorified sports heroes, the golden age of sports reflected common aspirations. Athletes set new records, inspiring ordinary Americans. When poor, unknown athletes would excel and become rich and famous, it showed that anyone can be anything. You just had to work hard for it. Some of these athletes are Gertrude Ederle. In 1926, at the age of 19, became the first woman to swim the English Channel. Babe Ruth, New York Yankee slugger, smashed home run after home run during the 1920s. When this legendary star hit a record 60 home runs in 1927, Americans went wild. Andrew Rube Foster, as pitcher and team manager, made his greatest contribution to black baseball in 1920 when he founded the... you know what? I'm not really allowed to say that, so I'm gonna just skip the name and put it on screen. There you go. Check it out. Although previous attempts to establish a league for black players had failed, Foster pushed and pushed to have black baseball players shine in their own spotlight, earning him the title, quote, the father of black baseball. America's most beloved hero of the time wasn't an athlete, but a small-town pilot named Charles A. Lindbergh, who made the first non-stop solo flight across the Atlantic. Although apparently very humble and modest, Lindbergh decided to go after a $25,000 prize offered for the first non-stop solo transatlantic flight. On May 20th, 1927, he took off near New York City in the spirit of St. Louis, flew up the coast of Newfoundland, and headed over the Atlantic. The weather was so bad, Lindbergh recalled, that, quote, the average altitude for the whole second 1,000 miles of the flight was less than 100 feet. Lindbergh's achievement paved the way for others. Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win a Nobel Prize in Literature, was among the era's most outspoken critics. In his novel Babbitt, Lewis used the main character of George F. Babbitt to ridicule Americans for their conformity and materialism. Some of his other books you might know are Main Street and Aerosmith. It was F. Scott Fitzgerald who invented the term Jazz Age to describe the 1920s. In this side of Paradise and The Great Gatsby, he revealed the negative side of the period's gaiety and freedom, portraying wealthy and attractive people leading imperiled lives in gilded surroundings. Ernest Hemingway, wounded in World War I, became the best-known expatriate author. In his novels The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, he criticized the glorification of war. He also introduced a tough, simplified style of writing that set a new literary standard, using sentences a Time reporter compared to, quote, round stones polished by rain and wind, end quote. The Harlem Renaissance was a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. People like Langston Hughes and Louis Armstrong really stood out, and people today really enjoy their work. The Harlem Renaissance paved a way for African American performers, writers, and musicians. And without the Harlem Renaissance, people wouldn't have gotten a full grasp of what their culture was like.
Dolly, I keep telling Dolly, you keep going, still going.